Monday, June 30th is the yearly standard ban list window, the one time out of the year where Wizards can actually ban cards in standard just to try to make the format as fun as possible for the next year of gameplay. So today we're going to talk about what I think should be banned in standard and what I think Wizards actually will ban in the format. So let's get into it. Need some magic cards? Well, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Before we get to the cards that I think could or should be banned in standard, we first need to talk briefly about the ban list announcement itself, since according to Wizards, the yearly ban list window, which is the one that's coming up on Monday, June 30th, is a little bit different than the set release ban list updates that happen periodically throughout the year. The way that bannings currently work in Magic is there's a ban list update a few weeks after every set release, and then a yearly ban list window, which is the one that's coming up on Monday. According to Wizards, the set release updates, at least as far as standard is concerned, are only for major emergencies, with Wizards citing cards like Oko Thief of Crowns or Felidar Guardian is a type of cards that could be emergency banned in standard. Clearly something like Monstrous Rage doesn't qualify, considering it not only made it through the last set release ban list update, but Wizards hilariously stated that standard was flourishing at the time. On the other hand, the yearly ban list window is different. According to Wizards, it's a time to make more nuanced changes to the format, with the goal of making standard as fun and dynamic as possible throughout the next year. Considering that we're currently in a standard that certainly isn't dynamic, with Izzet Prowess increasing its metagame percentage across a series of qualifiers until finally posting a more or less historic 42% play rate at Pro Tour Final Fantasy, and arguably isn't especially fun either, with many decks looking to end the game around turn 4 either with aggro beats from Mice and Prowess or combo finishes from Omniscience. Taking what Wizards has told us at face value, it seems correct not only to expect changes on Monday, but several meaningful changes. So let's start with the cards that I not only believe are most likely to be banned on Monday, but these are also the cards that I would be banning if I was in charge of the ban list update. Well, I realized that it wasn't printed all that long ago. The single most likely card to be banned in standard is Kori Steelcutter. Almost immediately upon its release in Tarkir Dragonstorm, the card pushed Izzet Prowess to the top of the meta, with a metagame share in the low 30% range across various RCQs, while there was some discussion over whether this was just players being lazy. This silly argument was laid to rest at Pro Tour Final Fantasy, where 42% of the best players in the world registered the deck for the tournament. Interestingly, while I was at MagicCon Vegas over the weekend, I got to talk to some of the players who were playing on the Pro Tour, and one thing that I heard from them is that Vivi was actually the card that was broken, but this was always followed by the player saying, but there's no way that Wizards is actually going to ban Vivi, and this I agree with. While I wasn't convinced that Vivi would actually be that busted in prowess, considering the results from this past weekend, it looks like I was wrong, but there's just no way that Wizards is going to ban one of the most iconic and most hyped cards from the Final Fantasy set just a few weeks after printing it. Another card that the pros often mentioned was Storm Chaser's Challenge, which they said happened to be your best card on turn 1 and also your best card later in the game when it can return a spell from your graveyard to your hand. Thoughts in that banning Storm Chaser's Challenge might also help future-proof the format from the return of Esper Self-Bounce being tier 0. It does seem like a sneaky dark horse ban candidate, although considering the lack of chatter about banning the card, I think the odds are probably against it. But back to Cutter. It's hard to see a world where it doesn't get banned. It's seeing lots of play in older formats, which helps cushion the blow of a standard banning, and there's just no way that Wizards can look at the Pro Tour meta where the deck took up nearly half the field and come away from it saying that this is fine. The problem number 2 in the format is the deck that actually won Pro Tour Final Fantasy in Mono Red Aggro or Mono Red Mice. Mice were the best deck in standard before Kori Steelcutter dropped and pushed prowess to the top of the format, but if you look at the results of Pro Tour Final Fantasy, I think you'd make a pretty good argument that Mice is actually still the best deck in standard after it posted a 60% win rate and put 4 players in the top 8, even though it only started at 11% of the day 1 meta. It's clear that the issue with mice revolves around the interaction between Monstrous Rage and Manifold Mouse, which together can give aggressive mice like Heartfire Hero trample and double strike, which potentially allows the deck to literally win the game on turn 3. While some have suggested banning Manifold Mouse instead of Monstrous Rage, personally, I would just ban them both. Mice have already had an entire year of being the best or among the best decks in Standard, and without another rotation until 2027, it's likely that it would remain at the top of the field for another year at least. It's possible that banning just one of the 2 cards would be enough to nerf the deck, but this plan has multiple problems. If you just ban Manifold Mouse, it's possible that we see some sort of Leyline of Resonance Monstrous Rage plan take its place. If you just ban Monstrous Rage, then mice can replace it with the admittedly worse but still functional pump spell like Turn Inside Out. Considering that the yearly ban list window is at least in part about fun,
this is one of the spots where we're going to be really thinking about how we can set Standard up for the most success going into the next rotation year. So much of this is not necessarily us thinking of if we definitely 100% need to ban something on power level. In a lot of ways, a ban and restricted list is just another tool for us to use to try and curate a fun environment. Like ultimately, at the end of the day, our titles involve game designer, right? We care a lot that players are having the most fun, and that frequently aligns with a bunch of other goals that we have.
And dying on turn 3 to mono red is one of the loudest complaints that I've heard from players about the format. My vote is that you gotta shoot the head to kill the ghoul, and you just ban both of the cards. Here it's worth mentioning that this is where we see the major flaw with Wizards' once-a-year ban list structure. If we had another real, and by this I mean non-emergency ban list update in a few months, I would definitely be on board with just banning one of the 2 cards to see if that's enough to drop the deck's power, and then if needed, ban the other one when Edge of Eternities or Spider-Man releases in a few months. But since Wizards has locked us and themselves into only banning once a year, I think there's more risk in underbanning and finding out that mice is still broken without one of their key pieces than overbanning. The upside of hitting mice hard is that it should allow for other aggro decks to develop over the next year. Right now, mice is so good that it's hard to imagine a hypothetical deck like Spider-Man Aggro or whatever else we see in the next year actually having a chance to thrive in the format, and I imagine that that's something that Wizards would like to see happen in Standard. This said, if Wizards decides to only ban one card from mice, I think Monstrous Rage is the way to go, in part because it also hits on prowess a little bit too, even though the prowess deck has been cutting some copies of Monstrous Rage, in part because it's been in the format the longest. When Wizards designed Monstrous Rage, they actually intended for it to rotate this summer anyway. The final card in the top tier for bannings is really more of a deck than a card in Omniscience. Well, I do think there's an argument that Omniscience might be less of a problem if aggro is nerfed. Right now, the deck takes advantage of the fact that to survive prowess and mice, you have to overload on cheap removal and sweepers, and cheap removal and sweepers are essentially dead cards against Omniscience, and if people could build their decks to focus solely on beating the combo deck, they might be able to. The deck posted a 20% metagame percentage at the Pro Tour, and despite missing the top 8, posted a very strong win rate. While I do think that it's fine to have combo decks in Standard, I also think the format's at its best if those decks are tier 2 or tier 3, rather than at the top of the format. Having a very consistent turn 4 combo deck that can also play the control role near the top of the meta is fine in a format like Modern, but not in Standard. Banning either Omniscience itself or Abuelo's Awakening, which reanimates Omniscience on turn 4, would get the job done, and in some sense, I don't really care which card they ban, but personally I would pick Omniscience for one big reason. It's from Foundations, which means it's never supposed to rotate. If Wizards bans Abuelo's Awakening, Omniscience combo will fade in the short term, but Wizards will have to avoid printing anything that can reanimate enchantment forever, or at least until 2030 when Foundations could theoretically rotate, and I don't think that Wizards will want to do that. On the other hand, banning Omniscience solves the issue in the short term and the long term, and gives Wizards the freedom to print whatever they want over the next half a decade. In some ways, this kind of reminds me of the Birthing Pod banning in Modern, where Wizards shouted out the fact that if Birthing Pod exists, it limits what creatures they can print in future sets, and they want to keep printing cool creatures, so Birthing Pod had to go. Banning Omniscience serves a similar purpose, letting Wizards design their sets without looking over their shoulder at the possibility of a card reanimating Omniscience and ruining the format. Overall, I would say there's like a 95% chance of Corey Steelcutter getting banned, and a 90% chance that either Monstrous Rage or Manifold Mouse gets banned, and a 50% chance that they both get banned. And Omniscience Focus banning, on the other hand, is much less guaranteed, but I still think the odds slightly favor either Abuelo's Awakening or Omniscience meeting its end. This second tier of possible bannings is even more interesting because it requires projecting what this standard format might look like once the cards from Omniscience and Mono Red and Prowess are already banned, which is challenging anyway, and even more so today when we're getting a new set every 2 months. I call these Reflector Mage bannings. Back during Kaladesh Standard, Wizards posted a ban list update that banned 2 very problematic cards in Standard in Emrakul the Promised End and Smuggler's Copter, but they also banned Reflector Mage, even though Reflector Mage and its decks weren't especially good at the moment, because Wizards was worried that the blue-white tempo deck would end up being too good in a world without Smuggler's Copter in Emrakul. If there's a Reflector Mage banning this go-around, the most likely target is Up the Beanstalk. The enchantment has already been banned in Modern, and it wasn't that long ago that Domain was the top dog in Standard. If Wizards is concerned that it will become the Tier 0 deck once Aggro and Omniscience are banned, they could just ban it now to be safe. Much like Monstrous Rage, it was a card that was designed to rotate this summer anyway, and despite losing key cards like Zur and Leyline Binding at rotation, the archetype has also gained some new ones like Unihope of Spira, and as we saw at the Pro Tour, Up the Beanstalk is so strong that it essentially creates decks like Golgari Graveyard, which is mostly a budget pile of draft shaft alongside the Chase Uncommon. Beyond Up the Beanstalk, it's hard to predict any other Reflector Mage style bannings. The only other 2 decks that would even be in the conversation are Dimir Midrange and Self Bouts. While neither is especially problematic at the moment, Wizards knows what's coming in future sets while we don't. If they know that something from Edge of Eternities or Spider-Man or Avatar is likely to push one of these decks to Tier 0 status, it's possible they ban something now to future-proof the format. The play experience of Hopeless Nightmare being bounced every single turn is pretty brutal, basically a standard version of the Grief Stam deck that dominated Modern a couple years ago. If Wizards decides the deck did need a banning, it seems like either Hopeless Nightmare or Nurturing Pixie would be the most likely card. As for Dimir, banning Enduring Curiosity would eliminate the biggest card advantage engine in the deck, and if you want to go really deep, you could probably make an argument that Preacher of the Schism pushes a lot of other cool 3-drops out of the format, although personally I'd be surprised if either of these decks was targeted. Like I said, if this did happen, it would likely be because Wizards knows the future and we don't, so there's probably not really much point in even speculating since we just don't have enough information. While perhaps not a Reflector Mage ban, Stockup also deserves a mention simply because its play rate is off the chart. While the best divination ever doesn't especially feel like an egregious design to me at the moment, when Wizards discussed their criteria for banning cards during a recent stream, they mentioned that being over 50% of the meta is one of the thresholds that they sort of look at. They mentioned that a card being over 50% of the meta in 50% or more of decks was at least one of their criteria for banning a card.
Talk a little bit about what that threshold looks like to you all.
Yeah, in general, I would say if there is a single deck that's occupying more than half the format or something like that. I know Omnath is something that we saw around ZNR Standard. That was right before I got hired. I was personally playing a lot of Omnath. But things
Omnath
like
and
that.
Oko, best of friends.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Oko's another great example. Cards that are just such severe power outliers that it's not possible to compete with them on any axis.
Now, we didn't go deep into standard play rates, but you mentioned the 50% threshold. Are any decks anywhere near that?
I don't think so, and it's also not clear to me that a single card needs to be above 50%. It's not exactly a hard number or something. Obviously, things can be environmentally warping to a degree that we might take action.
And Stockup was the single most played card at Pro Tour Final Fantasy, showing up in 53% of decks, while nothing else was over 37% of decks. So just by the numbers, it's in the conversation at least. This said, if you look at the most played cards in Standard, they're pretty much all Is-It cards, and there's a lot of cards in this range. The entire list of the top 10 most played cards in the format are Is-It, except for Sideboard All-Star Ghost Vacuum. For example, Torch the Tower is in 56% of decks, and I don't think anyone's calling for a Torch the Tower banning. Instead, it's just the best removal spell in the most played color combination in Standard. This begs the question, is Stockup a problematic card, or did it just happen to be a very good card that's in the right color combinations to see a ton of Standard play? That's a question that Wizards needs to answer. The fact that it's become an immediate staple in both Legacy and Vintage clearly shows that the card has power even beyond Standard, but those are both blue-driven formats too. It's possible that just nerfing Is-It will bring Stockup's play rate down to a more palatable number. I say the odds are against a banning, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it did happen, just to remain consistent with a quote from the banning stream. So those are the cards that I think are at least in the conversation to show up on Monday's ban list update. So let's wrap things up today by sharing the cards that I would ban if I was in charge, and then what I think Wizards is going to do on Monday. As far as what I would do, in a world where we only get one real ban list update each year, I'm a firm believer that it's better to ban too aggressively than too conservatively. So I would start by knocking out the big 3 red cards of Corey Steelcutter, Monstrous Rage, and Manifold Mouse. And I'd hit Omniscience too, on the theory that it's better to ban the payoff than the support card, so Wizards can keep printing enchantment reanimation in the future. I'd be tempted to add Vivi here too, just because I'm worried that in 6 months it might dominate the format, although in reality, it's just too early to ban anything from Final Fantasy, no matter how scary the card might look. A better fix would be to have multiple ban list announcements to put less pressure on the yearly update, but Wizards has confirmed multiple times they aren't interested in banning more than once a year in Standard outside of emergencies. I would also ban Up the Beanstalk, not because it's too good right at this moment, or because it's guaranteed to be too good in the future, but because there's some chance it's going to be too good in the future, and its original design was to leave Standard this summer anyway. As for what I think Wizards will do, the 2 cards that I think are more or less guaranteed to be banned are Corey Steelcutter and Monstrous Rage. I also think that it's more likely than not something from Omniscience gets targeted, especially now that current builds don't really lose anything meaningful at rotation outside a temporary lockdown, and if Mice and Prowess are nerfed, lockdown becomes less important anyway. I also can't shake the feeling that Storm Chaser's talent is much higher on Wizards' list of potential ban targets than it is on the community's list. I'd still say the odds are against the banning, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was one of the cards that got a lot of internal discussion at WotC during the banning process. I also imagine that banning Vivi is a non-starter for Wizards, but after this weekend, I wouldn't be surprised to see Vivi at the top of the list next year when we're talking about what should be banned in Standard. Taking this together, my actual prediction for what's going to be banned on Monday is Corey Steelcutter, Monstrous Rage, and Omniscience, although, like I said, I'm holding out hope for at least a couple more bannings as well. Anyway, that's what I think could and should be banned on Monday, but let me know what you think in the comments. Do you want bannings? If so, what cards do you want banned? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon.